Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the inaugural episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Podcast, and I am Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program. Joining me is Danny Machado, an associate in our Washington, D.C. office. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's great to be here.
In each episode, we will focus on a specific drug pricing topic, and after discussing the substance, we will ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. Danny, what is our topic for today?
Our topic today, Chris, and our listeners will appreciate it, is the fact that we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but more specifically, the fact that CMS recently issued final guidance or revised guidance for the drug price negotiation program part of the IRA as it applies to the initial year of its applicability, which is 2026.
Right. So I think one of the key questions with this guidance having now been issued is how does the final guidance differ as compared to the proposed guidance that came out in March? And it seems that in large part, CMS continued with the approach it had suggested in the proposed guidance, most importantly, using active moiety for drugs and active ingredient for biologics to identify the drug that's subject to negotiation under the IRA. And the technical term in the statute is qualifying single source drug, or QSSD. So the statute contemplates Part B as in boy drugs joining the negotiation program in 2028. But the way that CMS had set up the QSSD definition in the proposed guidance caused a problem. And the problem resulted from looping in different drugs with the same active moiety or different biologics with the same active ingredient across FDA approvals, across NDCs, and thereby also across Part B and Part D drugs. So for example, a manufacturer could have multiple biologics with the same active ingredient, some of which are used in Medicare Part D as a dog, in other words, they're self-administered. Others are used in Medicare Part B as a boy, in other words, physician-administered. So the active ingredient QSSD definition would have looped both of those parts of the drug, the Part D and Part B portions, into the same QSSD bucket. And that's a problem because the IRA discusses what happens with the Part B payment rate for a drug when a maximum fair price negotiated under the IRA is in place.
Right. The IRA tells us that the reimbursement for Part B as in boy drugs is not going to be the traditional ASP plus 6% that we're all used to. Instead, it'll be the maximum fair price plus 6%. So you imagine the situation, Chris, that you were just mentioning, a manufacturer that has a series of biological products, they all share the same active ingredient. And then because of that, they're all brought into this process. They all have been negotiated with, and when a maximum fair price is established, even those Part B as in boy drugs would be subject to that maximum fair price. Now that is against the letter of the IRA. And what it seems to be happening here is that CMS seems to have corrected this in the revised guidance. They didn't do so explicitly, Chris. I think we were both chatting about this earlier, and it seems like they did it pretty subtly. And what they may have been thinking is, well, we don't want to call attention to the fact that our definition is probably a little broad, that it, caused this issue. But what we're going to do is find a solution. And the solution that they propose is, okay, fine, we'll keep this active ingredient and active moiety definition for qualifying single source drug because it helps us bring in a ton more drugs than we otherwise would be able to. But when it comes right down to it, we will look at the National Drug Code at that NDC level. And if there's a drug that is not used in Part D as in dog, well, then that drug just doesn't get selected. That drug doesn't get identified as a negotiation eligible drug or gets published in September.
So then we can look at how CMS addressed that issue in the final guidance. And what they seem to have done is become more precise when the guidance talks about publishing the selected drug, which will happen in September of this year, when the guidance talks about what is subject to the negotiation process, and finally, what is then subject to the negotiated maximum fair price. And what CMS seems to have done here is slice and dice a little more finely by providing now that when the drug is published in September, the drug will be published, the active moiety or active ingredient will be published, but there will also be a list of NDCs or national drug codes. And what CMS says to us in the guidance is the NDCs included on that list are the ones that have historic Part D as in dog utilization, or where CMS believes that there is likely to be future Part D as in dog utilization. So in the example that we mentioned, where a manufacturer has different biologics that share the same active ingredient, some of which play in the Part D space, others in the Part B space, most likely what would happen here is that list of published NDCs would omit the ones that have only Part B as in boy utilization, and in other words, are not playing in the Part D as in dog space.
And so by doing this, CMS is able to indirectly say, well, if there's a drug that is paid under Part B as in boy, that one would maintain the ASP plus 6% reimbursement, and therefore CMS is not adopting a definition that would be in contravention of the statute, and only Part D as in dog drugs would indeed be subject to negotiation and subject to the maximum fair price for initial year 2026.
That's right. And what's odd is that the guidance never calls out this change or explains the rationale for the change. So the way the guidance document is structured, there is about 100 pages of final guidance. That's the second part of the document. And the first 100 pages are the preamble consisting of comments that CMS addresses and then the CMS response. And nowhere in the document does CMS explain why it is now doing the more fine-grained slicing and dicing here of what is published, what is subject to negotiation, and what is ultimately subject to the MFP.
And an interesting change indeed, because CMS had indicated that the definition of qualifying single-source drug would not be subject to comment, right? That was part of the initial guidance that CMS said, well, we're not inviting comment. And of course, stakeholders still commented on this very important topic, and it seems that at least someone may have raised to the agency's attention this potential contravention of the statute.
I think that nicely sums up the substance, which takes us to the next question: which Olympic sport is it? So we have our list of sports open here. I think we have to agree at the outset that we can never pick boxing. Otherwise, every one of these issues is going to start looking like boxing. So I'm still sort of in the hand-to-hand combat area here. So for me, karate is a pretty good match because it involves not just attacking, but also strategy, blocking, thinking carefully about the next move. I don't know, Danny, which Olympic sport did you think it most likely resembled?
Karate is a great choice, Chris, but I was thinking something a little bit on a different level. I thought of weightlifting. And you know why? Weightlifting is a sport that tests strength, power, technique. And I think we're seeing an agency, CMS, that's kind of testing its own strength. The IRA certainly empowered it, but we see a definition of qualifying single source drug that is extreme, perhaps to some, perhaps a little more broad than it would have been expected. I think we're seeing an agency that's testing its own strength, perhaps weightlifting, if you will.
Excellent choice, Danny. Excellent choice. Well, I think that nicely sums up our podcast. So, Danny, where are we going for the after party? What's next?
Chris, I was thinking we should hit up that spot we did a couple months ago. Remember we went to Jaleo. For those of our listeners who are not in DC, Jaleo is a Spanish tapas place that is close to our Washington, DC office. We love it. We walk to it often. If you are at all a fan of paella, as I am, then you will absolutely love this restaurant. And Chris, I think we're going to have a good time.
Excellent choice, Danny. Excellent choice. Thanks to Danny for joining me, and thank you to our listeners for checking out this inaugural issue of the Latham Watkins Drug Pricing Podcast, which is part of our Connected with Latham series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. and you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.